Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to our online audience, and welcome back to those who have already tuned in to the previous session. This panel is called How to Deal with Peace and will address the P in the Nexus. So look into how humanitarian and development actors can contribute to peace. To discuss these very complex yet crucial questions, I welcome my distinguished guests for panelists today, Martina Zapf from Interpeace, Martha Tukahirwa from the SIHA network, Rebecca Richards from the World Food Programme, and Filipa Schmidskino from the International Committee of the Red Cross. My name is Sonja Höfmann, and I work as a research fellow with the Center for Humanitarian Action, and I'm very excited to chair this panel today. Before we dive into discussion, a few notes on housekeeping. So I kindly ask all online audience in the Zoom chat to keep their video and audio off. If you have any technical issues, please send a direct message to the user CHA technical support. And I would like to draw your attention to those streaming in via Zoom, but also via YouTube, to post questions in the chat, which will be addressed in the last third of the session. While the dual nexus of connecting humanitarian action and development is much more established, with a long history of, for example, LRRD, linking relief, rehabilitation, and development, the peace pillar forming it into a triple nexus is relatively new. So peace came into this triangle, as was already established in the opening this morning, through the Secretary General, and the idea that only through peaceful societies it is possible to end development and humanitarian needs. So basically there are two ideas behind it. For one, because there's really never enough money to cover all the needs, and there's increasingly less money, or the gap is indeed widening, there's increased pressure to cover those needs better and increase efficiency of our responses. But more importantly, because the realities of the affected populations do not fall into the siloed approaches of those actors and categories that we have as aid agency. So we really owe it to them to provide the best interlinked response possible that we can give. Yet there are also concerns and caveats associated with linking the three sectors. To name just two, there's uncertainty, for example, how peace is conceptualized. So what it entails, do we mean social cohesion when we talk about peace, or do we mean more comprehensive conflict transformation strategies? Do we regard peace as a bottom-up approach, a very inclusive process, or do we also mean stabilisation missions or peace missions by that? Secondly, there's also unclarity of how active or passive different aid actors should contribute to the peace pillar. So is it more of a minimalist approach that, for example, humanitarian actors engage conflict sensitively, or make sure that their programs do no harm, meaning that their programs do not exacerbate existing conflicts? Or do we see it as a more active role that programs of humanitarian and development actors also contribute to active transformation and building trustful societies? So in fact, the key challenge is indeed how can we link those different sectors while respecting each other's mandates, traditions, and principles. And we've heard today that the humanitarians very often voice their concerns that humanitarian principles could be diluted in our sessions today. But in fact, I'm curious to learn perhaps also the peace community has some concerns that their approaches and their concepts might be watered down if everyone engages in peace building. With those questions in mind, I'd like to hand over to my first speaker, which is Martina Zapf. She's a senior manager with Interpeace, where she advises a range of actors how to best support locally led and sustainable peace. Martina also manages the Peace Responsiveness Facility, which seeks to help organizations operationalize the sustaining peace and Triple Nexus agenda. So she really is quite experienced in all those topics, has engaged extensively in capacity development, learning, and evidence building of actors across the spectrum. My first question to you, Martina, would be, as a peace expert, could you shed some light on the broader perspective, what is meant with the peace element, and what does the peace community think about the Triple Nexus? With that, I'd like to hand over to you.
Thank you, Sonja, and it's great to be here. Thank you for the opportunity to engage on this important topic today. And I think we have a recent event that really very powerfully highlighted the contributions that humanitarian development actors can and should indeed make to peace. And that's, of course, the Nobel Peace Prize being awarded to WFP this year. And I just want to renew our congratulations to the colleagues who are also represented on this panel. And I think that's a really powerful reminder and an illustration that this is possible and it's needed. And while we're celebrating it, we also shouldn't forget, though, that we still have a long way to go to deliver on the commitments that we have all made and signed up to around the Triple Nexus, around ending need, around localization, and around the sustaining peace agenda, all of which really requires a deliberate intent to contribute to peace. It does require, in our view, going beyond conflict sensitivity and do no harm, which are, of course, a fundamental basis. To us, the Triple Nexus is really not about greater coordination between the sectors. It's also not about turning humanitarian actors into peace builders. But it's really about understanding that we are all working towards a shared goal, a collective impact of supporting self-reliant, resilient, and peaceful societies ultimately. And each sector and actor obviously should contribute to that in accordance with its mandate, capacities, but with that overarching goal really squarely at the center and in focus. At Interpeace, we started to engage with the humanitarian community several years ago in the lead up to the World Humanitarian Summit. And we started engaging in that dialogue because in many contexts where we work as peace builders, we saw how humanitarian actors inadvertently affect critical issues that are of concern to us as peace builders, such as the relationships between different social groups, the relationships between people and their authorities, dynamics of inclusion, exclusion, etc. One example that we learned about during our field research in the DRC was where a humanitarian organization over several years supported running a local hospital, then left the context and handed the local hospital over to be run by the government. That failed and the hospital wasn't able to continue providing the services. And so, of course, that's of concern from an aid effectiveness and a sustainability perspective. But from a peace building lens, this massively affected the relationships between the people and the authorities in that situation, in that context. And that's what we as peace builders are very concerned with when issues like that occur. So we started to discuss the question, how can humanitarian action contribute to local capacities for resilience to conflict, to social cohesion, and to inclusion? And there are many positive examples where that already happens, but there are isolated instances. They're not happening systematically enough and deliberately enough in our view. So for us, there are several levels of change. Primarily, I would say 3 levels of change that we see needed and that we're also working on together with partners in the humanitarian and development sectors. And the first one that responds to your question, Sonja, is really to demystify peace, to enable such contributions more at the operational level. And there also the paper by the Interagency Standing Committee Results Group 4, which is about to be released on the P and the Nexus, really clarifies that peace is not only the big political agreements, that is what we call peace spelled with a capital P, but there is also a lot of contributions to peace that can be made at more community level, which we then refer to conceptually as peace with a lowercase p. And there we feel that humanitarian actors, not so much changing what they do, but how they do it. And of course, linked agendas like accountability to affected populations and localization are already going in that direction anyway. So ways of contributing to peace can take many different forms that can be built into humanitarian response without taking away from the core mandate of humanitarian action. For us, an important point is that the starting point really has to be a comprehensive understanding of the context. I think we're guilty of this across all of the sectors, including the peace sector, that we tend to look at the context from our narrow mandate, from our narrow lens of our mandate, rather than really looking at comprehensively what's going on in this place. What are the needs and priorities also as defined and understood by the actors on the ground and local populations? And how do we as an international system then in partnership with local actors respond to those comprehensively? As peace builders, by the way, we are also ourselves seeking to work in more integrated ways with humanitarian development actors, because as our French-speaking colleagues often say in local contexts, on ne peut pas manger le dialogue, you can't eat dialogue. So we fully recognize that so many interconnected humanitarian development and peace needs in these contexts, that we need to find more integrated ways of working in aligned ways that allow us to fulfill our respective mandates, but come together and meet the shared overarching needs. And for us, then, in order to make these kinds of changes possible, what we're repeatedly seeing is that, and I think the conflict sensitivity methodologies over the last 20, 30 years have really experienced this. They've conducted a lot of training's been conducted, a lot of guidance has been put out. What we feel is probably a weakness is that we haven't really paid enough attention to organizational change. Because what these agendas call for is really changing how we as organizations engage in these contexts, and how to anchor that in our organizational strategies. So to shift the goalpost is not only delivering humanitarian outputs, but it is laying foundations and contributing to resilient and peaceful societies. And then really institutionalizing such contributions through looking at how do we design projects, how do we implement projects, how do we monitor and evaluate projects, and shifting from an over-focus on outputs to also looking at the process of engagement and the relationships by which we engage on the ground with local actors and how that contributes to resilience and peace ultimately. And lastly, the third level that we see and that we're working on is the systemic level, because we're all part of a big system, and certain parameters and incentives are set by other actors, primarily, of course, member states and the donors who have a role to play in all of this, who very often shape the silos. I was in Central African Republic last year, and some NGOs were telling me on the ground, you know, we are water tankering to supply local communities with water. We would love to build wells and to have communities manage local water infrastructure, but the donor doesn't allow us because the funds come from the humanitarian pot. So we know that some of the challenges start even further up in the system, and that's a dialogue we need to have at that level with donors. Overall, we feel really that our sectors need to engage more with each other. I've seen, even myself over the last 5-6 years, I've seen a huge change. I mean, there's much more dialogue happening between us and humanitarian actors than it was. But there's still a need for much more exchange and learning with and from each other. And I really resonate with something that Marc Dubois has said, and I know he's on the next panel himself, that we don't need to over-formalize the nexus or over-define it. What we need is nexus thinking. And Marc himself defines that as referring to a culture and ideology where the mindset within the three sectors is sufficiently cross-pollinated, that the differences become technical, they become technical challenges that can be addressed rather than normative or hierarchical.
Thank you so much, Martina. I do have a follow-up question to you. In your peace responsiveness facility, you advise actors how to become more peace responsive, or peace effectiveness is also a term that you use. Can you explain a little bit what that means and give some practical examples or share some advice that you give to organizations?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so very concretely, we are really working in comprehensive change processes with organizational partners, where we look at how can this agenda be anchored in the institutional strategies and overarching goals, and how can it then be operationalized through, like I mentioned, project design processes, and mini processes, adaptive management practices. How do we shift the relationship with implementing partners on the ground, how implementing partners are chosen, what legitimacy and trust do they have in the local context? Do we only hold them accountable to delivering the output? For example, we worked on a project in Somalia with a development humanitarian multi-mandated agency who was rehabilitating water irrigation canals. And of course, when the engineers went out and looked at, well, with the resources we have, how do we best utilize them? They suggested rehabilitating all of the main irrigation canals. When we then did an analysis of the community relationships, potential tensions and conflicts, and started to engage the community and actually identifying how could this project best be undertaken, well, the decisions turned out quite different. It didn't end up being only the primary irrigation canals, but actually a different web of canals. And that space has to be given to implementing partners. That is not just about, as per the contract, have you rehabilitated 5 irrigation canals and done that to the best of your technical ability, but how has that taken into account and engaged the communities? How has that impacted relationships between groups that are in tension or conflict with each other? How has it affected the relationship between government and population? How has it affected dynamics of inclusion, exclusion? Because very often, particularly local implementing partners, they are aware of these dynamics, but very often they're not really given the space and they're not listened to bring these to the attention higher up in the chain where decisions are made. That maybe shifts in the project would deliver better outcomes and also contribute to peace.
I think this is an excellent bridge to my next speaker. Thank you, Martina, for those very interesting insights. I'd like to now turn to Martha Tukahirwa, who is a women human rights defender and peace builder, streaming in from Kampala today. She works as a regional communications and advocacy lead for the Strategic Initiative for Women in the Horn of Africa, short SIHA network. In her advocacy and communication work, she builds, strengthens, and fires up women's collective power in peace building in the Greater Horn of Africa. Welcome, Martha, to our panel. I think Martina already touched upon the importance of the local level, and with that, I would like to pose to you the question, in your work with SIHA, how do you perceive the connection of development and peace building work? As a peace builder, how do you perceive this idea from your view from the practice? With that, over to you, Martha.
Thank you so much. First of all, I would like to thank you for providing me a space to be a part of this discussion and also share experience from this part of the world. So in terms of the work that we do, SIHA network is majorly a women's rights network that really looks at building the capacity of grassroots women-led civil society organizations. And without taking so much time, the work that we do has really firmed up our ideology that there is a lot of expertise and knowledge at the grassroots level. And when we're talking about peace building initiatives, we must refer and make sure that we're doing this in consultation with the communities on ground. In terms of how practical the Triple Nexus approach is, I must say that within that development world and also very much through that civil society perspective, this in theory, it seems like it works, but practically speaking, we notice that there is a lot of siloed approaches. So humanitarian actors are, carrying out their own work, development actors are doing their own work, and peace building, activists also doing their own work. And so there is very much not enough opportunity to be able to consolidate our efforts. As Martina had said, I think we're increasingly having those discussions, especially when we're talking about learning, what approaches have worked. And I think on ground, we're looking at hybrid approaches. So for example, you'll see maybe humanitarian actions will maybe look at, for example, like, these cash allowances or these cash, I don't want to call them handouts, but payouts that they make, let's say, to the communities. And for us from the development world, we're looking at how do we build on the agency of, these community members to be able to then make decisions on how they can earn income and that sort of thing. And so from there, we talk about peace building right from the domestic setting and then onwards up. And so we really, I think through this triple nexus approach, we do not want to farm up the dependency syndrome, which we have seen, especially for us who are working on ground. We notice that communities know that humanitarian actors are on ground. This is the support that they're providing. And then when we now move from a conflict setting to a post-conflict setting, then you realize that you've actually not carried out, you've not contributed to transformative change. Mm-hmm. And really what you're doing is glossing on that top. And so whereas it works, there is also, we really want to move away from that dependency syndrome. We also, we keep talking about peace building and the rhetoric of peace and security, but that can't happen against a non-functional, country structure, so legal frameworks. And so when humanitarian actors, I know this conversation is quite controversial because we also have to consider the principles that humanitarian actors adhere to, and also the way that they want to avoid the politics of trying to transform societies. But unfortunately, especially in this, in the region that I work with, the Greater Horn of Africa, we have seen that there are deeply entrenched negative attitudes and cultural norms. And the only way that those can be transformed is through really looking at how does power come into play. And when you're talking about power, then it becomes a politicized conversation. And I think, and so for peace builders like myself or activists like myself, we really look at how do we rebuild the society from ground up. And the only way that we can fuel this is by acknowledging that people, especially for me as a women's rights activist, women have the agency to be able to make decisions on their own. And then it's a spiral effect, so if they recognize that they have agency, then, they're also being, they're demanding to be in these spaces that have been traditionally, taken up by men or patriarchy or, people that have had power for a long time. And so they're countering that. And then you then have them penetrating those spaces that they originally were not penetrating. But in terms of, also civil society organizations, we are highly, highly dependent on aid and rather on funds, and our work is very much donor driven. So whereas I think Martina also mentioned that there is so much focus on outputs and really not looking at how do we, understand the factors that contribute to conflict. And so really looking at what are the root causes. And so whereas we can have that discussion on the Triple Nexus approach, I think it's also important to really look at how do we think in that way. Practically speaking, it seems like it's a little bit too ambitious. But I think, again, building on what Martina said, it's this nexus thinking and really looking at how do we pull best practices from the different sectors. Yeah, so thank you.
Thank you, Martha. I would just have one follow-up question to you. So also what, an idea that was already shared during the first panel, INGOs often report that local organizations are not familiar with the jargon, but when you explain what does Triple Nexus actually mean, they say, oh, we do this already. So from your experience also engaging and advising those local organizations that you work with, how can we make sure that the Triple Nexus is more localized, or that this idea, which is already implemented from local organizations on the ground, also trickles up to higher levels?
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that question. I think it's true. I think this is already happening and I think it's been rolled out even without having identified it as a Triple Nexus approach. Practically speaking, we see that a lot of civil society is their capacity is being built by these, humanitarian actors and these development actors, and so you find that civil society organizations are now better armed to respond to, the different humanitarian and development needs, and so practically speaking, it's, for example, convening spaces where humanitarian actors and civil society and development actors are in one space. And I think we've seen that, especially during this COVID time. We realized that we all can't be operating in a vacuum. And so we quickly had to come up with hybrid approaches. I want to call them hybrid because they are unique, and we had to do this in consultation with communities so that we're able to, and then you had, like, for example, development organizations or local civil society organizations were, for example, sewing masks and giving them out, and practically speaking, everyone was stepping in to bridge those gaps. It's still, we still have a lot to learn, and when you talk to, and this is why I was saying that we don't want to really build on that dependency syndrome. It's really to say, how do we build capacities and then local capacities and enable these communities and community-based organizations and local organizations be able to respond effectively. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Thanks so much. With that, I would like to turn to the next speaker. Rebecca Richards is Chief of Emergencies and Transitions at the UN World Food Programme, where she's responsible for strategy and partnerships in WFP's humanitarian development and peace work. Sounds like you're a Triple Nexus organization already. She also oversees the Peace and Conflict Office, which focuses on the organization's contribution to peace, which also formed a knowledge partnership with the Swedish Peace Institute, SIPRI. Out of this cooperation came several evaluations of WFP's contribution to peace. And as Martina already mentioned, WFP has also recently been awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, which also hints at your engagement in peace. Rebecca, with that, can you elaborate a little bit on WFP's Triple Nexus approach? Why should we care about peace, or why should WFP care about peace?
Hi, it's lovely to be with everyone, and thanks so much for putting this panel together. It's hard to follow Marta and Martina, but it's a real privilege for me to have a chance to speak with you. And thank you very much. It's been a busy sort of 10 days, and I have to say that I was really excited about participating in this panel because it gives me a chance to really talk a little bit about where WFP is in terms of its thinking on peace and in terms of the Triple Nexus. You read out the title of my office, and we deliberately tried not to use the word nexus because it can be so confusing at country level. And that's something that we've battled with a little bit. But I hope that I can have a chance perhaps to outline where our thinking is on peace in particular. We're a dual mandated agency and probably the largest operational footprint globally. And I think it's a responsibility that we have. It's something we've been thinking about for a while. We have a peace building policy that came into play at around 2013. And over time, it was apparent that the work of food insecurity, the work of the World Food Programme is heavily impacted by conflict. In fact, the OECD was predicting in their State of the World report that by 2030, 2/3 of the world's poor are going to be in conflict settings. And for us as WFP, we're concerned with the most hungry, and 700 million hungry are actually 60% of which are affected by conflict. So these are stark numbers that have really forced us to take a step back and look at the settings in which we work, have forced us to take a hard look at our operations. Martina said something in the beginning of her introduction, which was really powerful for me. She said, you know, it's important we demystify peace, and it's important that when she was looking at our operations, that we, in some cases, organizations are doing more harm than good. And I have to be very frank and say that WFP is definitely in the category of having to take a second look and be more careful and thoughtful about how we work, especially these protracted conflict settings. So perhaps I'll give you a little bit of a background, if I may, on the work that we've been doing. In 2018, we formed a partnership with the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. And the purpose of this partnership was to ask a reputable external body to come in and help us look at our operations and help us see where we need to do better. And first and foremost, to understand whether there really is a contribution to peace. And I know there's a large theoretical conversation around big peace and little peace and peacekeeping versus social cohesion. Putting all of that aside, we really wanted to have a sense of where does WFP sit against this conversation. And so CIPRI came in and they had a look at 4 of the countries in which we operate with very different sort of models and settings. And the findings were incredibly important to us. And I'll ask Joe to put the video into the chat if any of you want to see the video later. But maybe just to summarize what we found out, that we found out basically there's good and bad, that if WFP wants to be having a more stronger or a more deliberate approach to peace, the foundation needs to be conflict sensitivity. We need to be conflict sensitive, in our approach, in our thinking, in our planning, in our design. And the reason this surfaced is because we found that in some countries, we have a huge opportunity to support the poorest of the poor with economic empowerment, a chance of access to livelihoods, a chance to work. And in doing so, how we do it and how we design it and how we deliver that sort of package of economic empowerment, including the sustainability issue, could either provide social cohesion and real prospects for the future or not. And so this sort of balance between the two really came out into the open. The second finding that we saw through our work was that much of WFP's responses in countries were at scale and through social safety nets, and social safety nets also including our school feeding programs. So the delivery of these services, especially when it comes to our linkage with governments or governments in fragile contexts, allows us the chance to strengthen the links between people and the state. And of course, that's a very tricky conversation, I understand, especially in those settings where you don't yet have a democratically elected government. But that ability, even before, to provide an element of a shock responsive social safety net could really help bolster both social cohesion and the link between the citizen and state. We saw this, for example, in Iraq with the public distribution system. Being able to understand varying levels of vulnerability and be inclusive in that approach, already sets up a system that can provide a stronger foundation to reach all the communities in the future. The third area, which is quite interesting, I have to say, was around the access to natural resources. And we found that by working with the communities and in the way that we designed our programs in terms of access to water or the retention of land in countries where there is a strong climate change impact in conflict settings. We know the farmer herder issue in the Sahel. In Kyrgyzstan, there was a particular issue in terms of Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, access to water and irrigation canals. I think Martina also mentioned a similar one earlier. But these can help to build social cohesion at a local level. This was quite stark for us. I think the fourth is also really about the trust amongst communities, and how if we're in countries where we've been maybe for 30 or more years, we have an opportunity really to embed at the community level, work with our partners. The localization issue that was mentioned earlier is critical to this, but in doing so, embody a sense of cohesion and trust, and working with the communities to understand the grievances and the differences and try to mend some of those bridges. So these were exciting findings for the World Food Programme. Some less exciting findings around the issue of general food distribution at scale and what that might be doing in terms of stabilisation. So we've decided to go into a second phase to look more closely at this, more countries, and a focus on gender, a focus on cash, climate change, and also looking more closely at stabilisation. So I'd like to perhaps close there so that we have a chance to talk a bit more and have some questions. But suffice to say, we've learned a lot. There's more to do. The foundation really seems to be that conflict analysis as a first step towards designing a program, operationalizing a program, and ensuring our response is conflict sensitive, protection risks can be considered, and really about trying to be better within the system in terms of working with our partners. And that includes partners and organizations like Martyrs before me. It includes that research and training and capacity strengthening component like Interpeace. I think it's time WFP has opened its eyes and really wants to be a stronger contribution to the improved prospects of peace. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Felipe. If we can perhaps linger little bit on the programs that you already touched upon a little bit. So I think a crucial question to the Triple Nexus is how much are we relabeling already existing programs to be now also called as peace programs, or do we actually change our approach and engage more extensively in peace building in a more comprehensive sense? So can you elaborate a little bit on the programs that WFP is engaging with that you consider peace related?
Sure, that's a great question actually, and I think it's very important that we don't relabel just because it's the new fad or just because we're chasing funds. And in WFP we found that there is a little bit of a tendency to think you might be doing something that you're actually not. So more of an effort has happened internally to really hold the mirror up and to be thoughtful and to be critical of ourselves, which is hard. It's hard for an organization like ourselves, but it's also really important because when we do make change and when we consider that kind of organizational change that is really needed to move the ball forward, it takes time, it takes effort, it takes a mindset. So in terms of our programs, which you asked me about, our school feeding programs in Mali, for example, it is easy for us to be asked to deliver a school feeding program in a certain area by the government. But if we were to take a step back and say, look, that particular school doesn't necessarily include all the ethnicities of those tribes and communities around, it just includes one, let's make it a prerequisite to have an inclusive and equitable participation of children in the school where we deliver a school feeding program. That's already, it's an important first step towards social cohesion. So that's one practical example through school feeding. The second one perhaps is our Food for Assets work. We do provide a lot of training and capacity strengthening, but also a chance for communities to work on the land in order to help grow the crops, retain water, and how we do it in terms of building that approach through the community can actually make the difference between resolving grievances between two warring communities, or could actually help to build a level of trust and a social compact at a local level that can be quite foundational towards the future. So those are a couple of examples. I think maybe it might be worth mentioning social protection. I think the social protection system is underpinned by vulnerability and analysis and really knowing who needs assistance, who doesn't, and the varying types of assistance. WFP's got a huge piece of work that is the foundation for any kind of food security assistance that we provide. But we don't, for example, collect all the information that might be useful when it comes to contributing to peace. We used to collect information on food security and vulnerability around nutrition and food security, access to food. But if we were to collect information, for example, like the ethnicity, which I know is very sensitive with all the data protection issues around it, that could make a big difference in terms of the shock responsive social safety nets that we do build globally. So perhaps I'll stop there, and you'll know that I was very careful not to use the word peace building. I think it's important for me to say that WFP is not a peace building organization. What we do realize is that where we are, by doing no harm and by being conflict sensitive, we provide a good foundation for where longer term approach to peace can take hold. But I don't think it would be right for us to say that we are in the peace building realm.
Great, thank you so much, Rebecca. With that, I would like to turn to the last speaker of this round, which is Philippa Schmidskino from the International Committee of the Red Cross. She's a policy advisor, and she guides ICRC's policy engagement and reflection on the issue related to the long-term consequences of conflict. She has also elaborated the ICRC's position on the Triple Nexus in a comprehensive Q&A, which was published in the International Review of the Red Cross. Philippa, to quote Peter Mora, he said, "Humanitarian actors are not peace builders. Neutral, impartial, independent humanitarian action is distinct from political agendas, and it must remain so. Yet, he would argue that while others make peace, humanitarian action helps to make peace possible." How so? How does the ICRC, with a mandate to work in conflicts, position in this debate? With that, over to you, Philippa.
Thank you very much, Sonia, and good afternoon to everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here with you. Indeed, this addition of the peace dimension to the humanitarian development nexus has created a certain discomfort within the ICRC, and I think for many other organizations working in conflict zones. And this is in no way because we do not feel concerned by the pursuit of peace. Quite to the contrary, it's actually part of the fundamental principle of humanity. The discomfort has to do with approaches to the Triple Nexus that focus on bringing together humanitarian development and peace planning and programming frameworks, which have been kept distinct for a reason, namely to enable an impartial action in places where peace is very often anything but consensual. And so expectations, pressures, perceptions of joined up work, for instance, with military actors who are often lumped into the peace dimension of the Nexus discussion, bring this really into sharp focus. And I think Karsten in the earlier session alluded to that. And the dynamics we're seeing in some contexts at the moment really caution us to take a careful approach to perceptions and to reinvest and even to an extent go back to basics on civil military coordination. protect the humanitarian space, really. On your question of how do we then approach this discussion on the nexus, at the ICRC, we try to approach it not as a programmatic framework, but as a pool of expertise, resources, influence, which can help us build a sustainable humanitarian impact in our work with affected populations, in particular in protracted crisis. So the starting point is not the nexus. It's the situation of people who are looking to build or rebuild their lives in places with pervasive insecurity and social, economic, and political fragility, which require a bigger toolbox than an emergency relief only. And so we look at the actors involved in development, in peace building, in peace and security, whatever you call it, and think, can we learn from them? Can we collaborate with them? And can we influence them in order to save lives, alleviate suffering, and protect the dignity of people? So the objective really is and remains humanitarian. So we're looking at a broad spectrum of interactions. With actors outside the traditional humanitarian sphere, from knowledge exchange all the way to advocacy, which is a quite different type of interaction. So what are some of the examples that we have, and what could be distilled in a way to help us articulate what might constitute a peace-related activity? I would give maybe two illustrations which are particularly relevant to the peace topic. One is the example of our role as neutral intermediary in the framework of broader peace discussions. The recent prisoner release in Yemen comes to mind as an example, and this is where we facilitated the return of prisoners to their families after an agreement between the parties. This type of intervention is admittedly a bit ICRC niche, but it's a helpful example to highlight a very important point, which I'd like to make, which is the difference between a humanitarian and a political approach to a peace-related activity, if you will. So the fact that neutral intermediary interventions can help to build trust and perhaps foster future dialogue between parties is most definitely an incentive for the ICRC to accept to play a role. But our primary objective there is humanitarian, in this case, helping to bring prisoners back to their families safely. So this means that we're not involved in the negotiation itself. We might provide technical or legal advice if needed, but we're not involved in the negotiation of who is released and who doesn't. We act also only once there is agreement between the parties and only to implement a specific measure. In contrast, a political stakeholder involved in such an activity will be involved in brokering the agreement and will continue to engage well beyond the implementation of a first confidence building measure, so that the onus of result is a lot bigger. And so the blurring of lines between humanitarian and political objectives would definitely jeopardize our ability to play an intermediary, a neutral intermediary role. And you can apply a similar reasoning to pretty much any other humanitarian activity which takes place within a broader political landscape and tries to in a way, bring opposing parties together. The other example I would give is the integration of social cohesion indicators in our methodology to assess socioeconomic resilience. And this is as part of our economic security program. I think this touches on points that were already as well mentioned by Rebecca and Marta and Martina. But a question: why did we decide to include social cohesion indicators? The reason is because we know that a community with a strong level of social cohesion and might have less conflictuality and might be better equipped to handle, anticipate, and deal with shocks, including during a crisis. And so a high social cohesion score tells us that there's an opportunity to strengthen and capitalize on social ties to build a more sustainable impact. And on the contrary, a low social cohesion score might lead us to engage a bit differently with that community, analyzing the drivers of that fragmentation, the impact they're having on people's well-being, safety, and their daily lives, which in practice means also bringing in the protection teams, and to see how our program might progressively help to build more cohesion. But so this social cohesion analysis, which borrows expertise from development and peace building sectors, is helpful to improve the quality of and the impact of our social economic security programs, but also to help us make sure that we do no harm in a community where social ties have been altered. This really touches on the question of conflict sensitivity. 2 points maybe to distill from this as we think about how to define peace. I think bringing people together around a common objective is arguably a defining feature of a peace-related activity, but it needs to be done well. And it requires the ability to engage with all sides, which is often an added value of a humanitarian actor who is used to operating impartially in a very polarized area. The second point I would distill is the importance of keeping humanitarian and political objectives distinct when examining how humanitarian actors might play a role in peace-related activities writ large, let's say. If these objectives are blurred, then the added value of the humanitarian actor is lost, and so it's very important to safeguard that. I'll stop there for now. Thanks.
Much, Filipa. With this first tour of the table, I would like to open the floor for all panelists also to discuss among each other. Perhaps physically raise your hand if you would like to contribute something. I will then see it on the screen here. And I would also like to remind all those in the Zoom chat, but also streaming in on YouTube, to pose your questions, which will be addressed in a short while. So with that, I would pose a question sort of to the whole panel, but also more specifically to Martina. So you heard from Philippa this very a humanitarian approach with the social cohesion analysis as a way to sort of engage and do no harm, be conflict sensitive. Would you say this is enough, or is there no humanitarian approach to peace? I mean, if we look at service delivery, for example, education, health services, these might be fairly easy done. But if we look more to comprehensive peace things, for example, fighting corruption, as Marina Caparini said in the opening dialogue, access to justice institutions. These are quite political things where you need to take a stand, otherwise I think it's not possible to engage. So are we really kidding ourselves a bit as humanitarian actors?
I mean, I think as we all said, so do no harm and conflict sensitivity really are the foundation for everything else. But the policy frameworks that we have of ending need, of sustaining peace, of the nexus, they do call for something more. They do call to go a step further. And conflict sensitivity, when you really look at the methodology closely, leaves off at reflecting on how do you, as a humanitarian development actor, or also as a peace actor, how do you minimize and avoid any harm, and how do you maximize your positive contribution to both addressing conflict drivers as well as strengthening peace drivers. I think that's another thing that we often tend to overlook. We focus on, when we think about contributing to peace and addressing conflict, we focus on addressing the conflict. We're much less actually focused on and take into account how to strengthen peace and how to actually identify, how to not only look at where it's burning, but how to look at the resilience that is there, the agency Marta mentioned that is there, which is always there in any context. We ourselves started an approach like this in Libya, where a lot of actors are from the outside viewing it as, everything is chaotic and dysfunctional. But then we conducted a peace mapping, and you can actually find communities that are more the more resilient and more peaceful than others. And you look at, well, what are they doing differently, and how can that maybe be broadened out? So I think that's another really important factor to look at. Yes, okay, we need to address conflict drivers, but we also need to strengthen peace drivers. And I think that's another important role that humanitarian development actors can very well play and integrate into their actions, that doesn't take away a compromise on the principles or is well within the mandate.
Thank you. Would anyone else of the panel like to touch upon these issues? Rebecca.
Thanks. I think it's a fine balance, and I agree with Martina completely, but I also wonder if organizations like ourselves need to be more ambitious in terms of advocacy, and advocacy in the sense of engagement with certain political arms, especially where we do have now a certain sort of level of attention. We are constantly calling for ceasefires and for the ending of conflict, but perhaps we don't do as well when it comes to planning, for example, with peacekeeping missions, or the stabilization arms, the more political, harder aspects of peace. And maybe we need to also break out of our silos and be a little bit more open in terms of the dialogue, not in terms of compromising our humanitarian principles, but in terms of engaging, planning, and building that mutual understanding that is needed across the pillars. So just something to put out there.
Thank you. Anyone else would like to jump in? Doesn't seem to be the case. Then I would pose a question to Filipa. ICRC has typically this rather narrow life-saving, alleviating suffering, but you added also the dignity element mandate. But you also sort of expanded your scope. You now have a policy also engaging on education and emergencies, also sometimes providing a bit more of a sustainable approach to health sector work. So do you see a shift necessary to work in protracted crisis, which goes beyond what you already do in this rather narrow approach of the humanitarian mandate? And perhaps while you think about an answer, you can also touch a little bit upon your thinking at ICRC about some of the rather crucial factors, for example, protection of IHL, or so international humanitarian law, but also protection of civilians, which are crux of the matter with the peace element.
Thanks, Sonia. A lot of questions there. Maybe on your first set of points around an expanding mandate, education, and building more sustainable humanitarian impact. What I would say is that those are operational adaptations to operational context, really. I mean, this idea that a humanitarian actor only works in the short term is in a way is, I would say, a narrow perspective of a small part of what humanitarian action is, meaning, your typical life-saving relief. If you look at the work of the ICRC since its creation, the work on legal norms, behaviors of parties to conflict and so forth, do have a very, very long-term perspective. And so the adaptation in terms of those assistance programs around education and other issues really are about good programming practice in the face of contexts where people are seeking a different type of support, and also need a support that takes into account their ability to rebuild their lives, their prospects, and so forth. And so education really is a stark example of that, and we've been mindful as well to not become an education actor, but rather use our added value to promote access to education rather, and embed that aspect in all our assessments in a way. On your question on the tough issues of protection of civilians and respect for IHL, and how this all relates to the nexus. I would say first and foremost that we need to make sure that the onus and responsibility for protecting civilians stays where it should be, which is with states and parties to conflicts. One good thing that could come out of this move from the double to the triple nexus is a more robust diplomacy and political influence. And I think I think I might be the fourth person today that raises this issue, but this really is extremely important to ensure the protection of civilians, because without this, achieving peace will be harder. The OECD DAC recommendation mentions it a little bit on the side. The States of Fragility report of the OECD this year has a discussion paper on it, so it's an interesting space to watch. A second and related point, I would say, is that there's some work perhaps to be done to build a stronger awareness of the long-term consequences or dividends of protecting civilians during conflict. It's often overlooked, but the extent to which IHL and other international norms are respected inevitably plays a role in the recovery, in the well-being of people in the long run, but also in the relationship within communities and between communities and authorities. And so this should be studied more closely, because if we have stronger evidence of long-term dividends, then it could help us build a political incentive for the protection of civilians during conflict. So perhaps a policy, a research agenda there emerging. And a third and final point, if I may, on this question of protection of civilians, has to do with making sure that protection work is fit for the chronic and systemic nature of protection concerns in protracted conflicts. So these are situations where we don't necessarily have only an attack, a series of attacks, but where protection issues permeate people's daily lives. And so it's very important that protection work, people involved in protection work equip themselves to understand what individuals and communities themselves see as risks and threats, to cope with that, and what supports some methodologies, for example, around community-based protection, which allow us to do that and also challenged us to explore other approaches to protection. And in addition, it's important also to make sure that we deepen our engagement with authorities and promote systemic solutions to protection concerns. So there's work on legal frameworks is a good example, but other types of approaches that we've put into place is to bring on staff people with different profiles, experience working with armed forces, experience working with prison administrations, that really can bring a different lens to the observations that ICRC delegates do in their visits and in their direct communication with people. So these are just some examples, but I also really look forward to the discussion with Marc Dubois this afternoon on this.
Excellent. So are we. Perhaps a final question to Martha before I call my colleague Darina, who's been monitoring the chat while we speak, to my side here. From my own research on the Triple Nexus, I always feel like this blanket approach, as Karsten put it in the previous panel, is not really feasible. But instead, perhaps a more topical collaboration could be more of a framework to enable this linking thinking. So from your work with gender-based violence and also women's empowerment, do you think that it's perhaps easier with this topical approach or mindset to link different actors, because surely gender-based violence features in all of the three sectors, in the humanitarian work, in the development work, but also in the peace-building work. Perhaps with that, over to you.
Thank you. I think in a lot of the work that we do on ending sexual and gender-based violence, we have really looked at how we can take on a multi-sectoral, multi-pronged approach, because when we talk about how do we counter it, we're looking at, first of all, yes, the root causes, mindset change. And so we're working with, religious and cultural leaders and really looking at how do we create that systemic change. But also when it comes to response, especially to cases, we're working with so many actors. So yes, we're working with humanitarian actors and we're working with development actors. We're also working with state actors. And I'll give you an example. For example, in South Sudan, we currently work in WOW, which is the second largest town in South Sudan. We've been working with UNFPA and we've set up a one-stop center. And basically what happens in this one-stop center is that survivors of sexual and gender-based violence are able to access medical services, psychosocial services, and of course, legal services, all under one roof. And we've noticed that this is something that we would like to mimic across the different countries that we work in. One, because we've realized that we cannot work in isolation. And truth, the truth is that women have been brokering peace for a very long time, especially in this context. And so once we build capacity of, these women actors, these women peace builders, then you're really trying to, to inform and positively, positively change the way the community sees peace. And we've, I think that the number of cases that we've recorded, especially during the COVID situation, we saw the numbers go up because people we've created that trust infrastructure, and they're able to, to come into the one-stop center and get these services. And so this is, it really looks like we're going back to the basics, but that really works. And just to also add on to that, local civil society organizations have that expertise. I think I saw one of the questions where they were asking, maybe I'm going off on a tangent, but one of the questions was that who carries out conflict analysis? And truth be told, these are the people that are on ground. They're the ones who bear the brunt. And so they are best suited to be able to, carry out this analysis. We've been working with local researchers, local students, and really the kind of work that they produce is amazing. And we're able to look at the different dynamics that come into play that we would normally be, blind to. So I think while we're looking at how do we build capacity of local civil society organizations to work within this, Triple Nexus approach, I think it's also important to take into consideration the gender aspect, which is very important. And also just to also say that the existing peace and security paradigm has always looked at women as a homogeneous group, and that's where there's an issue. And so I think now, a lot of humanitarian actors and also development actors are now starting to look, move away from the othering of women and girls and really looking at how can we bring them in a way that they're able to contribute effectively. So yeah, I just wanted to say that. Thank you.
Thanks. Would anyone else of the panelists like to reflect on the issues that Filipa raised, but also Martha raised? I don't think that's the case. With that, I would like to hand over to my colleague Darina, who's been monitoring the chat. Can you tell us a little bit what's happening here?
Sure, Sonia, and thank you for the very interesting discussion. It's been followed very closely by our online audience, and we've already got some questions that I would like to introduce here. I have got 3 clusters, and let's start with the first one, which is actually showing that peace practitioners don't really know much about the working methods and way of working of humanitarian and development actors. Elke Gravert from the BIC is asking, how do the organizations that the panelists are working for actually do their conflict analysis? Which kind of experts do the analysis conduct the analysis, and what time frame do you consider when you do that, and which kind of local experts do you collaborate with? So how is actually this conflict analysis done in practice? Related to that, a question posed by Martin Menger from the Foreign Affairs Ministry in Germany. Actually, he posed it to Martina, but I think it's great to feed it back to the whole panel as well. Well, we are always asking about how humanitarian and development actors can engage in the peace leg of the Triple Nexus, but what actually about peace actors engaging in humanitarian and development work? Is there sufficient discourse among the peace actors, how they can contribute to reducing humanitarian needs? And on how they can engage with humanitarian actors without endangering the principled nature of humanitarian action. That's the first cluster. Back to you, Sonja.
Thank you. Well, I would hand over to the panelists. I think still writing down a few of the questions, so perhaps we'll start with the first one on the context analysis, perhaps with you, Martina.
Yeah, sure. And yeah, a really important question, given that we keep highlighting how important context and conflict analysis is. I posted a couple of resources also in the chat. And we as peace builders have also been learning a lot, because of course, when we do conflict analysis as peace builders for peace building programming, it's quite different, right? We often take actually a year, we talk to thousands of people across an entire country, plus diaspora communities, and we build our peace building program that way. Of course, that is not realistic or feasible for humanitarian development actors. So we've learned actually a lot in our collaborations with different partners like FAO and others, how to do conflict analysis in a light and accessible way, but that is still meaningful. And there are a couple of kind of principles that are emerging, which is around, local participation and ownership, because what we really need to engage is the local sense making of their context, which is important to actually have accurate information on what's going on and an understanding that's relevant in the context, but also to start to actually lay the foundations for programming is by engaging people and making sense of their situation, and setting priorities and creating a shared understanding of the needs. And another aspect for us, or another principle that for us is really important, is to look at conflict analysis from a systems approach and a systems perspective, because very often in the past, conflict analysis has been approached in too linear of a way that does not reflect reality in these very complex contexts, with all of these interlinking different dynamics, etc. But in our view, conflict analysis doesn't have to be super complicated or cumbersome. The important thing is that it's done together with local actors in a way that is useful, that's accessible, that doesn't require a whole lot of expertise. And then the other really important bit, because what we also often see is that beautiful conflict analysis are done and then they sit on the shelf because potentially an international expert is flown in, does this largely desktop based, maybe with some consultation, and then it has no actual bearing on programming. So that's really also crucial, is that we need to get a bit away from this outsourcing. Yes, of course, expertise can be brought in if it's necessary, but it's really teams themselves that need to develop this understanding so that they can then integrate it into programming, and that this bridge is deliberately built into the process of conflict analysis to how should this affect our programming? How does this lead to adaptations in what we do, and especially how we do it? That's really another crucial element. And yeah, like I said, I popped a few resources from FAO side in the chat, which I think are really illustrative of how these approaches can be fit for purpose in multi-mandated agencies.
Mm-hmm. Thanks so much, Martina. Anyone else would like to add on that?
Sonia, I may add on this, if I may.
Sure.
Sorry, I can't seem to find the hand button, so I'll just interject. No, I just wanted to pick up on the point that Martina made now about the fact that the importance of embedding conflict analysis in practices, and I think looking at the ICRC's approach, it is very much something that is organically built into the many contact and discussions that we have with communities, because the way we operate is a model where we're in direct access and direct contact with the people that we're working with, and so it really is part of a conversation that happens at multiple points during the, let's say, project cycle. So it's not that you would have a phase with a conflict analysis and then it goes into something else. It's much more organic. Obviously, there are moments in the year where there's more of an analytical phase because we're planning for next year. But it's very much something that's embedded throughout the activities because we have this model of direct work with affected communities. I think where organizations work with implementing actors, implementing partners, local partners, for example, that might, I think, reconfigure a little bit the dynamic. But for us, that direct contact does allow us to have an organic approach. The other point just I wanted to make was that it's also helpful to look into understanding the drivers of behaviors in the communities, obviously, but also in among parties to conflict and arms bearers, if you will. And we've developed quite an interesting methodology to understand that what makes a soldier act in certain ways versus in other ways, and how can we use that knowledge to better promote, in a way, the protection of civilians.
Thanks so much. Rebecca, you also raised your hand. I think we hear you, but no.
Sorry, I think that works now.
Yes, it does.
Okay, great. Just to add a little bit to what Filipa and Martina were saying, in our experience, engaging with experts who know the country context and really understand the dynamics of the country, because our WFP has a system where our leadership rotates. So you can go into a country for 3 to 4 years and then you move on. So having a real core understanding of varying conflict dynamics is critical to building the analysis, but also ensuring that it has that programmatic lens. And that's not so easy, actually. It's easy to find experts who know the country. It's difficult to find a level of conflict analysis where the organization can take it and understand what it needs to change at a programmatic level. That's what we've found. And so in our most recent experience, we've tried to change the methodology around that and ensuring that those staff of an external organization that we perhaps asked to come in and help us build that analysis are embedded in WFP assessment teams, so they get to understand what it means to deliver a food security program and the dynamics around it, so that the programmatic recommendations that shall fall from an analysis are really, really useful. So I think we're still learning as we're going, but initial lessons learned are quite interesting.
Thanks so much. With that, I would like to hand back to Darina for the second complex of questions.
Sure, thank you, Sonia. Well, the second complex that I would like to introduce to you as a panel is on operationalization and measurement. A question originally posed to Felipe, but I think interesting for the whole panel, is actually how can we operationalize social cohesion? Because regarding the indicators for social cohesion, this is difficult to put in practice very often for many humanitarian and development organizations. So what does the quantification of something as generic as social cohesion can tell us actually about the reality in the given context? Is there any approaches that you can share with us and that you'd like to present here? And related to that, Palong to Sam also asks, is there actually any peace minimum standards for humanitarian assistance? So again, it's about operationalization and standards and how to put that in practice. Do we have anything that we can orient ourselves on? And finally, Rochelle Eileen asks, or actually she wanted to comment that indeed data has been a great weakness regarding protection and linking it with the political buy-in from the government side. So how can we deal with this in order to have a more adaptive response and strategies? So this is the second cluster. I would like to hand over to you, Sonia.
Thank you, Darina. So perhaps we'll compose the first two questions in one, or perhaps not. Let's start with Filipa and the quantification of social cohesion.
Yes, it's an excellent question, and I think we have also still a lot to learn and refine the methodology to make sure that we're really capturing social cohesion or social ties that are have changed over time. And that may have been in a certain way if some time ago and have changed over time. So I think issues like the extent to which there is collaborative approaches in or collective assets, for example, that are shared by the community, the extent to which there is a diversity in who is involved in decision making at the community level. I mean, these are the sort of the things that we would be looking at. But I think it's true that a lot of it needs to be followed up on a regular basis because the situation is very fluid. What I would say, though, on the question of measurement, and without being over technical about all of this, is the extent to which maybe when it comes to social cohesion or other peace-related activities, humanitarian actors can be measuring impact really, as opposed to outcomes in a certain moment in time. And the extent to which maybe the expectation for humanitarian actors would be an expectation of effort as opposed to an expectation of result, just because it is looking at how we can do better through our humanitarian interventions, but knowing that they have an objective that may be slightly different in scale and nature than achieving peace more broadly.
Thank you. Perhaps Martha or Martina, would you like to take the question on the peace minimum standards?
Happy for Marta to come in and.
All right. In terms of peace minimum standards, I don't know if I can ably speak to this without considering the gender lens. I think in terms of what we in the within the women's rights movement and world are looking at are, for example, we have this UN Security Resolution 1325, and really we've tried to, there's what they call the national action plans that have been spelled out and that hold governments accountable. But I think also civil society organizations and some humanitarian actors are using some of these national action plans to be able to create these standards through which we can, work and operate in. But I think where the issue is accountability and how are we contributing to these reporting mechanisms. And so this is an ongoing conversation. I think right now we're celebrating 20 years of this resolution. And right now, when we monitor how far we've gone, it's not very far. And so, yes, we're talking about minimum standards, but what does that look like for each of us within our different jurisdictions? So again, this is an ongoing conversation. Yeah.
Thank you.
I think, Sonia, I think we've discussed this earlier, right? That a minimum standard really is do no harm and conflict sensitivity. And that has to be the basis, and we do have to self-critically assess and recognize that even with those approaches and methods being around for more than 20 years by now, it's not something we can consider accomplished everywhere and in the way that they should be. So there's still work to do on that, and ideally use that as a starting point to reflect on that further step, the more active and deliberate contribution to peace.
Thank you. If no one wants to speak up, I think we should get to a closing with this panel to all get lunch and have a break. What I learned today was, again, what my colleague Andrea already mentioned in the first panel on the practice, the importance of knowing your context and the importance of having analyses that are accessible and also digestible to the programs and work that each actor does. I think the importance of staff profiles have not been mentioned that much, but I think it's also quite relevant. Do we hire new staff to look into those aspects of conflict sensitivity and do no harm that are trained in that regard to help us be aware of the factors that are crucial for that? I think another key challenge is that we don't really have a governance body that is championing this debate within the humanitarian sector, which also leads to this diverse interpretation of the peace elements from sort of relabeling already existing strategies to organizations taking a more comprehensive approach to conflict transformation and peace building. And we also mentioned outspoken advocacy as a tool to also address this peace pillar without necessarily changing our approaches and our programs. With that, I would like to give all panelists the floor for a closing statement, like 1 or 2 sentences before we wrap up. Perhaps we'll do the same order in the beginning. Martina, would you do us the honor and start?
I was fearing that. Still connecting my thoughts. I think there's a lot of agreement, and whenever we come together for these conversations with humanitarian development and peace actors, yes, there are still some differences. There are hesitations and reservations, particularly around the humanitarian principles when it comes to interface with stabilization actors. But we do have a lot of common ground, and we do have policies and commitments in place. We have the OECD DAC recommendation on the Nexus. We have the Interagency Standing Committee now releasing a paper on the P in the Nexus. We have sustaining peace. We have the commitment to ending need. Like, we have everything that is calling on us to work differently, and a lot of efforts have been made to go in this direction. And so I just want to also avoid that we go in circles in these discussions, because we have agreement, we have the policies in place, and it really comes down to making it operational. And I think it was really great that a lot of examples and practices in that regard were shared on the panel on how that has been done in different agencies, how it is being done. And I guess maybe I'll pick up on a point that you mentioned, which we really discussed less, is what's the organizational change aspect? What do we need to change in recruitment, in procurement, in staff performance management, etc.? Because it really is also about ultimately shifting in these incentives and shifting what, at the end of the day, individuals and organizations, of course, are called upon to do, what they are rewarded for, what they get funding for, what requirements and obligations are incumbent upon them by donors, etc. So I think that is something that we keep discussing much less in these kinds of discussions, but which is really not to be overlooked. Like, we tend to focus on the programmatic and the tools for conflict analysis. Those are all important, but they in and of themselves are probably not going to cut it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Martina. With that, I'd like to hand over to Martha for any final words.
Thank you, Sonia. I just want to piggyback on what Martina said. I think it's really...
Oh, perhaps we have...
Can you hear me? Hello?
You're a bit fragmented, but it seems to be working fine now, so we'll start again.
Okay, I'll just do it quickly because the internet is a bit weak right now. So I just wanted to say that I think we need to really prioritize cohesion in everything that we're doing, but also whilst we're capitalizing on what each of us brings, like on a comparative advantage, we also must consider, the principles of inclusivity, diversity, but also really look at issues through an intersectional lens, but also exchanging knowledge as much as possible, because in policy, this approach looks great. In practice, it could be different, but I think there's ways in which we can visibly, or ways in which we can work together to, close these gaps and the loopholes. Thank you, Sonia.
Thanks so much. With that, I'll hand over to Rebecca for final words or final statement.
I was waiting for the host to unmute me. Thank you. I can't help but echo my fellow panelists, but just want to mention also that, we've had Security Council Resolution 2417, which was groundbreaking for WFP in terms of hunger and conflict. So I do have to say, along with Martina, that all the normative standards are pretty strong. But the OECD DAC recommendation that came into play was a huge step forward. And most of the membership of the DAC are very much part of WFP's own membership in terms of our board. And so it leads me to my sort of final point, that it's really about having a whole of society approach. So when we talk about breaking down cycles and making things practical, it has to stretch across right down to the local level. And I think that needs to be a real mentality change from everybody, including ourselves. We pride ourselves on being dual mandated. So the peace area is something new and thoughtful, but now is the opportunity to have a greater risk appetite while still respecting our principles and respecting our different parts, but really based on comparative advantage. I think this is, we have an opportunity to change things. So I think it's exciting.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. With that, I'd like to hand over to Filipa. All well with the peace pillar, or is your take a bit more concerned or a bit more cautious, so to say?
Thanks, Sonia. No, I think I would agree with Martina that there's a lot of common ground. I would also agree with the need to look sideways, learn to improve the impact of our action, and to also be acutely aware of the footprint that we leave behind. I think a lot of these tensions could be in a way overcome if we have an approach to the nexus that is not about joining up processes and frameworks, but really about exploring a much broader range of interaction, which doesn't necessarily mean doing things together, but that may also mean influencing each other as well. A last point I would say on hard peace versus soft peace. I think there's a zone of comfort, perhaps, around soft peace. So everything that has to do with community-based dynamics that are difficult to analyze and to follow, but who I think it builds a better zone of comfort for humanitarian actors. But I would say the hard piece needs to be part of the discussion. I think a lot of the situation that people in these conflict zones are in don't necessarily rely only on interventions in terms of how they deal with conflicts on a day-to-day basis. I think there is value in stepping up political engagement to find political solutions with the actors involved in hard peace, and so that should remain part of the discussion, even if it's outside of the comfort zone for some.
Thank you, Filipa. I echo your statement. I think this is really a crucial debate which still needs to be continued. Also, the bureaucratic streamlining and how we make sure that we interlink but not leave or forget about our modus operandi is, I think, really crucial for continuing the discussion. Just wanted to mention one point, what Martina said about the organizational change and the importance to look at those aspects as well. We will have a session tomorrow afternoon, which looks at how multi-mandated organizations grapple with the Triple Nexus, and a lot of the internal, intra-organizational things will feature in that discussion. With that, I would like to very sincerely thank all four panelists. I hope the online audience is giving you a thunderous applause wherever they are in front of their computers. I would also like to thank the online audience for staying tuned and engaging in the lively discussion which Darina put forward. I would also like to thank the team behind the scenes, and the cameras, which is not seen. We will now have a break for 1.5 hours and will resume at 3 p.m. European time for the spotlight sessions on protection, civil-military coordination, and German funding instruments. With that, stretch your legs, get some lunch, take a walk, and we'll resume in 90 minutes. Thank you.